Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome on a cold evening. It's a pleasure to have you with us, to have Keith Watenpaugh with us at the Academy for the better part of a week. We're keeping him very busy, but tonight is really the highlight from our point of view of his visit, his lecture entitled Suffering, Compassion, and Responsible Scholarship about the Middle East. As you know, it is also this semester's Richard von Weizsäcker lecture. This is on its own merit an extremely special and meaningful event for us at the American Academy. It's, as always, a great privilege to have Madame von Weizsäcker in the audience with us. With your permission, I will very briefly tell an anecdote which you know, but which you also know to be my favorite, from my own fellowship period at the American Academy in the fall of 2003. So some time ago, when President von Weizsäcker came also on a very cold, dark afternoon evening to talk informally with us fellows in the library just opposite. And at the beginning of his remarks, he said somewhat coyly that this was his second favorite room in Berlin. So obviously we immediately asked him, what is your favorite room? And his answer was the Philharmonie. And I have a particularly fond memory of that moment, which I'm sure was completely sincere and very meaningful. Keith Watenpaugh is an historian of the modern Middle East, of humanitarianism and human rights. He has lived in multiple areas in that region, including Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Armenia, Iraq, Egypt, Jordan, and Greece, but is now based in California. At the University of California, where he is professor and founding director of human rights studies. He has since 2003 directed a multidisciplinary international research program to assist refugee university students and scholars fleeing the war in Syria, which has won support from the Carnegie Corporation in New York and the Open Society Foundation. He is leading an effort to expand refugee access to higher education through the Article 26 Backpack Project, supported by the Ford Foundation. Article 26 Backpack addresses the social and institutional barriers that arise as refugees attempt to continue their education or gain employment. It provides capacity to store, share, and have evaluated documentation of transcripts, diplomas, and other key forms of certification. Keith Watenpaugh is the author of the award-winning book Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, and also of title, Being Modern in the Middle East, the first from 2015, the second, the earlier book from 2006. The 2006 book chronicles the rise of multi-ethnic, multi-religious middle classes in the city of Aleppo in the first decades of the 20th century. His work has been translated into Arabic, French, German, Turkish, and Persian. It'll be a pleasure to hear from him. Afterwards, as always, we'll have time for questions and answers from you. Please wait for the microphone to come to you so that what you say can be heard by people here and people not in this room. Please tell us very briefly who you are so that we know, and also for the record. And after the session, obviously, we invite you warmly to join us next door for a light reception. So thanks to all of you for breaking out through the cold, and Keith, it's all yours.
As I begin, I want to recognize Mrs. von Weizsäcker for joining us this evening, and also thank Michael and Pamela Rosenberg for helping bring me here. Lena Ringelb, who's kept me extremely busy all week, meeting with academic leaders and people involved in Berlin's very important non-governmental refugee support sort of scene. I also want to thank the fellows for a very warm welcome, which was much warmer than the weather, which was not hard as we begin this evening. Please accept my apologies in advance. I have a bit of a cough. We do get sick in California. It does happen, despite the weather, and I've brought some of that with me. So I'm going to take just a moment to pour myself some tea as I begin the talk. Let's only the American Academy did they bring it to you in China. As anywhere else in the world, that would have been a paper cup. There you go. So I will read part of my lecture to keep myself on time, and then I will start to wander into the images and so on. Unless otherwise stated, the images are from my own collection, and I try to bring in things that are the most original and the most appropriate to my lectures. So part one, 2001 Summer in Berlin and the Magic Mountain. Tonight, I will make an argument for the responsibility of scholars, particularly those in the humanities, arts, and social sciences, to engage in the development of broad-based responses to global human rights and humanitarian challenges. And I do so against the backdrop of the last 17 brutal, violent years of history in the Middle East. Yet as I was preparing my talk for this evening, I remembered that the last time I had spent a couple weeks in Berlin with Georges Khalil, of all people, it was a sultry July 2001, and I was an Alexander von Humboldt Program Fellow at the Wissenschaftscollege, the VICO, as apparently it's called now. And of all the books I could possibly have been reading at the time, I had in my backpack Der Zauberberg, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. I'm an American. It's like I'm going to Germany. What should I read? The Magic Mountain. Okay, it's a good book. So Mann's characterization, however, of the European elite's obliviousness to the corrosive effects of nationalism, militarism, hate, and colonialism in the era before the Great War stands as a stark rebuke to our own sense of scholarly inattention to what was happening in the Middle East at that time. Though not really so long ago, that summer, at least to me, seems consigned to an entirely different historical era. But my talk tonight is certainly not an argument for learning from history. It is instead a conclusion that I've drawn from the last 5 years of working to address the humanitarian challenges posed by the war in Syria. My conclusion is this: humanitarian and public policy designed to confront the problems of our time, refugees, migration, and inequality, lacks a needed and concerted regime of contemplative, analytical, and historical reflection, the kind of historical reflection that defines and sustains the humanities. And including that form of reflective practice in the broader global conversation about humanitarian action will foster creative, compassionate, and smart kinds of solutions that will better protect and extend human rights. This is much easier said than done, of course. This isn't a prescriptive policy talk either. Instead, I will share with you this evening my reflections on the way my own research as a historian of the modern Middle East and human rights has intersected with efforts to reduce the suffering caused by war and indifference. Part two, not there anymore. Let me start with a photograph that some people in this room will find very funny, that captures the sentiment of my talk's title. So I call this the Not There Anymore photograph. So Not There Anymore is that ugly but very functional jacket I picked up in Aleppo. That scarf is long gone. My chestnut brown hair and beard are completely gone, as you can see, something for which I hold my twin 10-year-olds completely responsible. But also what's gone is that 10th century minaret behind me from the Grand Umayyad Mosque of Aleppo. I'm standing on top of one of Aleppo, Syria's, and Aleppo, of course, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I'm standing on the roof of one of the city's famous Renaissance-era khans, or caravanserais, built at the time when the city was one of the world's great trading entrepôts. I was there conducting research that would lead to my first book, Being Modern in the Middle East. The minaret was originally built in the 10th century, and it's withstood earthquakes, the Crusaders, the Mongols, and the French, only to be leveled in 2013 by a shell during heavy fighting between, Islamist rebels and those loyal to the Ba'athist regime. I lived in Aleppo, as Michael told you, for several years in the 1990s, and before that in Damascus, Cairo, and Istanbul. But Aleppo is different. The city is remarkable in its beauty and complexity. I thought I'd share one of my favorite images of the city that will be familiar to some. This is, in fact, a stereoscopic view. You would have you could look through. It's like a old 3D technology. Let's just call it that. You would look through a lens into two images, and they would merge together to try to bring some illusion of three dimensions. And this is a picture of a clock tower that had been given to Aleppo by the Sultan Abdul Hamid II as a token of modernity, but also to get people operating on Western-style time, with a beautiful street scene in a square that has seen much trauma in the last 5 years. So Aleppo is a place where layers upon layers of history are visible as you walk its streets. It possesses a unique diversity of humanity. Before the war, the city was home to a major urban population of Arab Christians, the largest community of Armenian genocide survivors outside of Armenia, communities of recently urbanized Kurds, Turkmen, and Yazidis. And 80 years ago, that number would have included a population of Jews, some of ancient Middle Eastern origin, but others who could trace their presence in the city to the time of the Alhambra decree and the expulsion of the Jews of Spain. But more than all of that, I lived there. I had been fortunate enough to win several major grants, including the Fulbright Hays and the Social Science Research Council's Dissertation Research Abroad Fellowships, which helped me be able to live for extended periods of time in the city. Living for so long in the region improved my work, but also left me in a specific kind of indebtedness. My research, my professional standing, and my career have all been built on the fact that the people of Aleppo let me live in their city, use their archives and libraries, and tell their story. As historians and others in similar fields, we should be prepared to recognize this indebtedness within the framework of our profession and how it shapes individual and collective advocacy. As I watched Aleppo burn, sanctions and embargoes violated, red lines crossed, cities and neighborhoods destroyed, it was heartbreaking. Made the more so by the immense flows of refugees from the country, flows that included family, friends, and colleagues. Western inattention and inaction to addressing the suffering of the war were the norms in the early years of the Syrian conflict, and that has certainly not changed. In the spring of 2013, I began to travel a path of research, direct advocacy, and innovation. And it is a path which began with a simple research question, which, like all good questions, should start this way. I wonder what is happening with refugee Syrian university students and college professors. Just a simple question. I traveled to Jordan in the spring of 2013 to try to find an answer. At the time, there was something less than 800,000 Syrian refugees, which seems like a lot now, but in comparison to the fact that there are 5.2 million, merely a drop in the bucket. And I should note that at the beginning of this year, the UN estimated that there would be an additional 1.5 million refugees produced by the war in Syria. So this number, especially with the increasing violence in the Ghouta, but also around Afrin, this number of 5.2 million will probably be closer to 7 million people by the end of this year. So a decade before I went to Jordan that time, I'd become involved in efforts to help the Institute of International Education's Scholar Rescue Fund and the Gates Foundation assist Iraqi scholars in the years after the US invasion and occupation of Iraq, particularly in a period known as the War on the Intellectuals, when doctors, lawyers, journalists, and college professors were targeted by death squads and kidnapping rings. And I was curious if similar efforts were being mounted on behalf of Syrian academics. So I put together a small team of human rights specialists and grad students, and as we began our work in and around Amman, we became increasingly aware that the need amongst refugee students was acute, and more importantly, was being utterly ignored. And there were many more refugee students than we had anticipated. But that shouldn't have been unanticipated on our part. So the rate of pre-war, post-secondary attendance in Syria was around 20% of 19 to 24-year-olds. In other words, mostly in urban settings, but even amongst rural populations, the number of young people going to some kind of university or professional training or technical training in Syria was close to 20% of the whole, which compares very favorably with other regions, with other states in the Mediterranean region. Equally important, at the same time, women's attendance was usually equal to or even eclipsed that of men. So this is like everywhere else in the world right now, especially in California, where women often outnumber men 60-40 in many of our colleges and universities. And as the refugee population skewed young, it should have come as no surprise to us that many of the young men we encountered in Jordan had fled Syria to avoid compulsory military service, which also meant that their academic deferments were now canceled. So, yeah, it's a tough memory that I'm about to recall here. So in that early period, we would still encounter young people who had been involved in the peaceful Arab Spring protests that had been violently suppressed by the regime. And these, if you recall, there were these enormous peaceful demonstrations in the streets of Damascus over a series of Fridays that had were largely peaceful, but then were brutally suppressed by the regime. They had sort of seen what had happened elsewhere in the region and were very aggressive in their attacks on protesters. So speaking with this cadre of young people, we learned how quickly in the wake of the peaceful protests, the regime had cracked down on students and faculty at Damascus University and other institutions, and used the university, its administration, and a paramilitary Ba'athist student group as a tool of oppression to identify dissidents and marginalize or even violently eliminate opponents. If you were expelled from the university following any kind of procedure, you were liable for immediate conscription. Some told stories of being expelled from the university 1 hour and having to skirt checkpoints on the way home because they knew they would be taken immediately into the military. And these young dissidents were often quite highly skilled in computing, architecture, and similar fields. And some had even found work, always illegal, in the Jordanian economy. And at that point in time, most wanted to leave the region entirely. None expressed any interest in returning to Syria. And the ones that I grew closest to have all found asylum, primarily in Canada. In the spring of 2013, 350,000 Syrians had taken refuge in Jordan. And about half of those were housed in the vast refugee camp Mukhayyam al-Zatari. Between August of 2012 and March of 2013, the camp had grown from 15,000 to 150,000, making it the fourth largest city in Jordan, which it still is. The population of the camp had just doubled in the month before we arrived due to large-scale military activities in southern Syria. And while preparing to visit the camp, we met with UN officials, primarily in the fields of culture and higher education, and were told categorically that there are no students in Zatari camp. There's just none, which I knew was not the case, but told us much more at that moment about how the UN's humanitarian complex viewed Syrians. It was a testament as well as to the low priority placed on higher education for refugees in the planning and implementation programs of the High Commission for Refugees at that time. It was also definitive of the kind of what we call carceral humanitarianism, or sort of incarceration and humanitarianism, that prevailed in the way Syrians and certainly other communities have often been viewed in the humanitarian system. In other words, Syrians were, in that view, an undifferentiated sort of mass of inmates in institutions of sequestration, the camps, that held the individual in abeyance until they could be cataloged and then returned or resettled. But the more important point is that little effort was being taken to understand the complex and dynamic nature of individual refugees and their trajectory, and of possible opportunities embodied in exile. In all fairness, it's easy to criticize the UN. It's always easy to criticize the UN. But few experts imagined that the war would last as it has. I mean, most of us at the time thought this would end in 6-7 months, people would go home, that the regime would be overthrown, that there would be no foreign intervention, and just about everything we thought would happen was wrong. So few experts imagined the war would last as it has, and the UN's broader position was shaped by the expectation that the conflict would resolve. So on a warm spring morning, my research team and I met with dozens of those non-existent refugee university students at the camp. And it was a deeply inspiring moment for all of us. And these young women, with one exception, were in STEM and, sorry, I'm going to have to translate the Americanism. Science, technology, engineering, and medicine, and education fields. Many on the cusp of graduation. Most had fled because their fathers or brothers had been targeted by the regime. All wanted to resume their studies, and many had made the trip to the Jordan University campus in Amman to see if they could enroll. So it seems obvious now, but to understand conditions facing refugee university students, spending time in a seminar-like setting, right? This is very comfortable for an old college professor like me. Spending time in a seminar-like setting, talking, listening, comparing notes was very effective. And through that method, we achieved a clearer and more comprehensive understanding of the problems and barriers that these young women faced, but also the value they placed on education, especially those forced from a solid middle-class life to the very margins of society, like these young women. They indicated that they were under increasing family pressure to marry, that they all had problems with documentation of their transcripts and faced strange barriers, including trying to have official transcripts made available from universities that no longer functioned, a Kafkaesque nightmare when one is a refugee. Higher education costs were so high as to be unattainable. Indeed, as the numbers of Syrians swelled in Jordan, Jordan University abandoned the practice of charging Syrians the same rates as Jordanians. They used to charge them what we in America call in-state tuition. And with so many refugees there, they started charging them the full foreign rate, which if you're living in a camp like Zaatari, you're not going to be able to accumulate the money necessary to pay. I left the camp that evening and returned to Amman with the realization that this was more than just a problem that could be solved with a handful of grants or scholarships, sort of the traditional pathway of international education. But more so, what was at stake was the loss of an entire generation of young, smart, talented, and driven people who were supposed to be the region's doctors, engineers, teachers, accountants, and architects. My research team returned to the region a year later and initiated a more in-depth study throughout Lebanon. And in fact, we arrived just as the millionth Syrian refugee was registered by the UNHCR, and he was a 19-year-old university student named Yahya, John, who had fled across the border from Homs. In Lebanon, we again found young Syrians who were trying to connect, or indeed connecting, with higher ed. Many were working in the informal economy, some even in professional fields like pharmacy, accounting, and teaching, and others in low-skilled jobs like nannies or house painters and so on. Let me pause for a moment on this photograph. This is a very different setting from the camp at Zaatari. This is in urban Beirut. There are no large camps in Lebanon. Lebanon refused to allow the UNHCR to set up camps for refugees. And this is a school set up for an after-school program by an American-based Syrian NGO called Jasur. And these are some of the teachers, but also young people that were connected to teachers who were working there. And this picture brings up two issues. With one exception, these are all Kurds from all over Syria that had been to school. And remember how I talked about the possibilities of exile? The two women, when I would talk to them, said, we're not going to stay in Beirut. We're just here getting things together because we're going to go back to Kurdistan and help build it. So the war, like war often does, it opened up opportunities, especially for young women, to advance, but also to demonstrate sort of a newfound national identity and patriotism. The guy who's tugging his beard is a Palestinian Syrian. Palestinians displaced by the creation of the State of Israel, many of them moved into Syria, where they were never given Syrian citizenship, but a kind of de facto Syrian citizenship within Syria, still not completely citizenship. And they, of course, have been displaced equally by the war as well. But they're in an even more precarious position because they lack any identifiable international citizenship. So, following research in Turkey, we came up with a series of conclusions. I want to pause on this image as well. This is in the city of Gaziantep or Aintab in southern Turkey, which is in many ways has become a sort of northern version of the city of Aleppo. With so many people from Syria have moved there, but also historically it was part of the Ottoman province of Aleppo anyway, and the border that was drawn between the two cities just follows a railroad track. But these were young people who were, some of them who were going to what we would now call a Gulenist school, although I don't think they identified it particularly as such. And then a young woman who was able, through the auditing process, to become a full doctoral student at the University of Gaziantep, where, in medicine, where the language of instruction is English. But this was a particularly painful meeting for me, because as I watched these young people across the table, I noticed that they had all acquired very visible facial tics, that the young men smoked cigarette after cigarette after cigarette for a couple hours. There were just the detritus of, cigarettes were all over the table at the end. And this is, of course, America. We don't see this as much. And what I began to realize, and this is a couple more years into the war than even the first groups that we spoke to, which was the incredible psychological toll that this was taking on young people. And it was being manifest in the way they looked, in the way they behaved, but also how they were essentially medicating themselves against the stress and trauma through nicotine addiction, and then also heavy drinking and so on as well. So in addition to just the public policy initiative of trying to get people back into school for education, we were seeing an enormous amount of suffering amongst young people. But to a person, they would always say they felt the best when they were in class. It gave them a sense of order and dignity and direction, which I think was absent from their lives outside. So after this research, and this is research that's been confirmed by other groups like Robert Templer and so on who's in the audience tonight, there were three broad conclusions about higher education and the war in Syria. The first is that fewer than 1 in 12, or something around 8%, of university-eligible Syrians had connected to higher education opportunities outside of Syria. And most of those had been connected even before the war started. Second, attendance by female refugees had plummeted, and the parity between young men and young women enrolled in higher ed had utterly collapsed. Utterly collapsed. And this is not unique to the Middle East. In fact, I was telling a story earlier today where I visited colleagues at Fresno State University, one of these enormous Central Valley towns in California that produces half the world's food. And it's a very important site for refugee resettlement in the US. And NGOs and other service providers there had noted that even amongst refugees, Iraqi, Syrian, Afghan refugees coming to the US, settling where there was several universities and community colleges, that female attendance had dropped off similarly. So it's not necessarily about just being in another Middle Eastern country. Some other factors are at work here that must be addressed. And the third conclusion, and this was something that I noticed in Eintep, is that while the war was having a terrible effect on these young people, even amongst those who had been distant from the immediate zones of conflict, being a student helped mitigate some of the stress and trauma of exile and war. Part 4, Bread from Stones. So, while my colleagues and I were building a body of data, literature, and experience in the field of refugee university students' higher education, I was also writing my latest book, Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which was published by the University of California Press in 2015. And the work explores the international humanitarian response to another great human-made catastrophe. This one 100 years ago that inscribed some of the same territories and topographies of horror, displacement, and indifference of today's conflicts in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. In 1915, the military government of the Ottoman Empire, in the midst of World War I, sought to destroy the Armenian communities of Anatolia through genocide. And while there's an increasing literature that has emerged on the history of that genocide, I was much more interested in what was happening to those who survived. And I just very briefly, this is a image of the map of the routes of deportation that was developed by the Rockefeller War Relief Board almost as soon as it was happening. And I use this in my work to demonstrate how there was generally deep knowledge, and there often is, of humanitarian problems as they're happening. But I think a more interesting photograph is this one, which is an image of the first modern refugee camp at Port Said in Egypt that housed the refugees from Musada. Some of you might know Franz Werfel's The 40 Days of Musada, for example, which catalogs this. And what's even more exciting is that one of the fellows here, Carol, her grandfather was one of those young people who was taken to this camp in the period during the First World War. And many of them survived, many more died of disease, but then they were repatriated to Musada in southeastern Anatolia, only to face deportation again in 1939 when the French ceded that part of Syria to the Turks. So part of what I do in that work is locate an origin of contemporary human rights thinking in the practices and failures and practical failures of humanitarianism during the late interwar period, especially in the treatment of refugees. And one of these practical failures I write about, which is both fascinating and instructive, is the Nansen passport regime. And here we see a Nansen passport. At the end of World War I, and in the aftermath of both the Armenian genocide and the Russian Revolution, large numbers of displaced peoples were moving west into Europe. In response, the League of Nations adopted a travel document which was named for polar explorer, fish neuroscientist, great humanitarian, the Norwegian Fridtjof Nansen, who was the first refugee high commissioner, and in particular, the person who helped develop this travel document. So it wasn't a passport, despite its name. Instead, it was a broadly accepted identity document that empowered the refugee to seek employment in labor-starved Western Europe or even the United States. So, part 5, passports and backpacks. Now, Onik, this is the passport of a young man by the name of Onik Isbengian, who was born in Smyrna in 1907, contemporary Izmir. And this is in a collection of Armenian documents in New York. But the other side of this has all these visa stamps from all over Europe. Italy, Belgium, France, even Germany, finally Great Britain, which is where this was issued, and then an admission stamp to the United States. And I was always curious, why was Onik just traveling around Europe so much? He wasn't a very old guy. And then I realized he got to New York and enrolled in medical school at Columbia University. So what he'd been doing, like many of the young people I work with today, he'd been going from place to place in Europe, trying to find somewhere that would let him in so that he could be a student. And he ends up in the United States. He graduates from Columbia, marries a local American woman, founds a family, becomes a productive member of society, so much so that they valued this passport so much that they donated it back to the Armenian community. Now, there's one very important element of the Nansen passport that I think is relevant to what we're thinking about tonight, which is that it prevented a phenomenon in international diplomacy called refoulement, which is a very fancy French word that kind of is like refoulement. You never use this word in polite conversation. So imagine you're a refugee. You've left Russia during the revolution. You've left the Ottoman Empire because of the genocide. What is your greatest fear? That you'll be sent back to Russia, or you'll be sent back to the Ottoman Empire where you'll face death. And so with the Nansen, so every time you encounter a border as a refugee, that's something that could happen to you. You could be arrested and deported. So what the Nansen passport did was it guaranteed to a refugee that they could cross an international border to look for a job and not face refoulement, not being sent home. So what it did is it took this one incredibly important area of concern and fear off the table so that the refugees could effectively find work. It wasn't about their civil rights. It didn't protect them, but it allowed them to, sort of using the liberal economy to try to find a solution. So I tried to bring that thinking to bear on the problem of academic the acceptance of refugee student documentation that would allow information, not necessarily the young people themselves, to cross borders in search of opportunities more effectively and use digital tools to help in that crossing. And the ultimate goal is creating a situation in which a whole class of problems around refugee academic documentation, as Michael described earlier, storing, sharing, accrediting, reconstructing credentials, are off the table for refugees. Just get one big problem off the table because they have plenty more to address. And this is a prototype copy of my digital platform of the backpack. My staff decided they wanted to put this together for me for tonight. And it has one of my favorite things, which is the happy monkey emblem for the backpack. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a smiling monkey with ears. So I can talk more about how the backpack works, but it's very technical. Actually, it's not that technical, but we can go into depth in it during questions. So the Open Society Foundation helped us develop the concept of what we originally called a Nansen passport for refugee students, and we abandoned that because we decided that you should never call anything but a passport, because in modern society, a passport is a very powerful object. And it ultimately evolved in the Article 26 backpack, which is named for the provision in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees education as a human right. And now it's supported by the Ford Foundation. So as we were working to raise money, and this brings in, again, the question of responsibility, as we were working to raise money and awareness about the backpack, I made sure to talk about the idea directly with the kinds of young people that we plan to work with. And from the very beginning, refugee student educators, in particular like these who work at a refugee school for kids under the age of 8 in the Bekaa Valley, about 20 odd miles from the Syrian border, have been really important interlocutors with us on designing and developing what we're doing. Starting last fall, the UC Davis-led consortium, which also includes the American University in Beirut and the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers, began building support amongst local universities and non-governmental organizations and the government of Lebanon. This is one of our early meetings. Training volunteers from the American University in Beirut and Lebanese American University to work as backpack guides, people who help refugees fill their backpacks and establish their open it up and make sure it works. I mean, it's like any new application. You often need someone to help you work it. And our goal is to, in fact, turn over backpack guiding not necessarily to elite students at Lebanese universities, but rather to groups of refugees themselves. We've also used sort of non-traditional educational techniques, like we developed a comic book which is great because we can swap out languages. We can put Arabic or Farsi as we need. And then as we've continued to develop, we went back to the community's practice that will need the backpack. And here we see our Lebanese students helping the Syrians understand or practice using it. And this is still one of my most favorite of all photographs from this period, because at this point, the Americans have completely stepped out of the process. And these are Lebanese students, Syrian refugee educators and students, using the tool of the backpack, adapting it to their own use, working together in a collaborative fashion to do so. And it's just, as an educator, you look at that, it's like, yeah, this is what we're supposed to be doing. So I'm returning to Beirut in April to start the process of getting backpacks on the backs of some 600 vulnerable and refugee young people. And at the same time, we're building a cloud of credential evaluators and admissions officers throughout the Middle East, Europe, and North America. Let me move to my conclusion. We wanted workers, and human beings came. In the spring of 2016, at the Idomeni train station in Greece, which is right on the border with Macedonia, I again spoke with young Syrians, this time Kurdish sisters from the very troubled town of Afrin, which is under siege. They were living in a makeshift refugee camp on the border with Macedonia. Just a week before I met them, a small boat had carried them across the Aegean from Turkey. Back home, the women, both in their 20s, had studied pre-med at the University of Aleppo. The older sister did the talking. She explained that they worked 16-hour days in an Istanbul sweatshop to make money for the passage, and indicated that they had faced sexual violence. Like thousands of others at that camp, their onward march along the railroad tracks was halted by the abrupt closure of the border. Soldiers, concertina wire, and politicians riding a rising tide of xenophobia blocked their way. I later learned that they had slipped across the border with the help of a human smuggler, and Facebook tells me they are in Vienna. And I still correspond with their elder cousin who lives now here in Berlin. And I'll never forget the only thing the younger sister did say during the entire conversation, which was, "I will not go back to Syria. I would rather have drowned in the sea." And I believed her. And as I looked out over that camp, which to my mind constituted a failure of Europe as an idea to respond in a legal and humane fashion to a predictable movement of humanity, I couldn't help but conclude I was seeing something new in one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of our generation: the permanent displacement of millions of Syrians. These are people who will be unable or unwilling to return to their homeland even if the war ends. And were 25% of the present refugee population not to repatriate, it would mean well over 1 million people for whom the world would need to find a permanent home, something it has done for other populations of even greater relative size several times in the 100 years since the end of World War II and I. So my own opinion is that most of the refugees outside of Syria's borders will not return. And if they do, it will take the better part of a decade for the bulk of that process to in fact begin. So that reality, before I get to the very deep part, this is one of my favorite photographs. The Syrian kids had seen the Greek kids make and fly kites for Easter just before I got there. And so the kids were taking old tent poles and scavenging trash can liners and making their own kites. He's the one who got it furthest off the ground of any that I saw, but I always enjoyed that. So the reality of this enormous permanent displacement of Syrians confronts democratic societies like Germany and other states built on the rule of law and commitment to human rights with a critical and difficult series of questions. And this is not news to this audience. But there's one question I wish to raise in anticipation of our event tomorrow night on the role of the humanities and Willkommenskultur. Is our basic responsibility towards refugees and other newcomers in our midst civic integration or social inclusion? Now, civic integration has many shades of meaning in both English and German, and I've heard several different definitions of what it is during my time here. But as I understand it, it is the legal movement of individuals into a state's basic civil rights regime that also anticipates the adherence to a handful of social, cultural, and political attitudes that are considered part of the national identity of the receiving state. They must adapt themselves, fit in, learn the rules. The Netherlands will test individuals on their understanding of Dutch society, for example, with pictures and music and other tools to see about a comprehension of culture, mores, and history, all of which is seen as critical elements for civic integration. By my understanding, social inclusion is a different approach that doesn't assume that many of the elements of the newcomer's sense of self and group belonging must be abandoned or thrown off for successful membership in a new community. Rather, it builds on a practical compassion that anticipates that just as they are asked to change and adapt, a similar process of change and adaptation will take place in the host society. Indeed, social inclusion requires change from all sides in this equation. But the benefit of this approach is manifold. It builds better trust, political engagement, patriotism, social cohesion, and solidarity in a way that compulsory civic integration cannot. Higher education, universities, the arts and humanities institutions and organizations are well positioned to help in this process, and indeed have already been playing that role in German society. But regardless, the leading edge of any project for social inclusion will be occupied by refugee university students and young intellectuals. Still, and equally important, winds of policy in Europe and North America are blowing us into a historical moment during which refugees and migrants will no longer be viewed as human beings, but rather as units of labor. In my opinion, a gross violation of human rights and the principles of shared humanity. And it will diminish the ethical bases of our societies and place all of our human rights at risk. It is also a collective failure of imagination. As I tell my students, any one of us could be a refugee. Perhaps most vulnerable is the integrity and long-term viability of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and its unambiguous and robust commitment to protecting the refugee as an individual with human rights. Again, with their emphasis on the human and capacity to define and defend the human experience, the arts and humanities must confront the cynical economic realism decried by the Swiss playwright Frisch some 50 years ago. And those looking to defend the utility and relevance of the humanities should look to these opportunities to engage in building pathways for social inclusion for refugees and other vulnerable peoples. So when I would sit with young Syrians in tents, bookstores, cafes, abandoned train stations, or classrooms and listen to them across the table as they describe studying engineering to go home and rebuild, is what they would tell me, or wanting to become journalists to replace with the truth of their experience the lies they'd been told by their governments their entire lives, I would see in them immense hope and human potential. But I also saw the young people who will lead the effective transition of refugee communities through a just and fair process of social inclusion. And I see in them what I see in my students back home in California. I see in them our future. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you succinctly to describe a little bit more the backpack.
Sure. So the backpack is a way to safely store, share, and have evaluated critical academic documents, as well as other creative works, poetry, architectural drawing, stories with universities or with scholarship organizations or possible employers. And it's also a way to connect large numbers of refugee university students with the global community of credential evaluators who can help in the process of assessing documentation, but also engage in a very difficult and important process of reconstructing someone's academic history if they only have sort of bits and pieces of it, that will try to sort of at least figure out where they could enroll in higher education.
Hi, I'm Amy Remensnyder, a medievalist. And the question I wanted to ask is, recently, the head of the IRC came and gave a talk about the refugee crisis and made some of the same points that you've made about the difference between this refugee crisis and previous crises and the humanitarian response needed. And one of the points he made was a point that you made somewhat, you didn't emphasize it very much, and I wanted to ask about the implications, which is he made the point that he was talking about younger children, that they're too traumatized to go right into education, that they desperately need education, but they're too traumatized psychologically. And so you had made the point about the chain smoking, et cetera, students. So I'm wondering what you think about that. If these students, are they ready to go into the classroom, or does there need to be some kind of other intervention first or simultaneously?
So this is Miliband who came to, right? My own experience with younger children in education has been quite the opposite, which is getting them into school is one of the most effective ways to address trauma. And that's, I see a different group and I have different circles, primarily people involved in, directly involved in refugee education, both at the higher education level and at the elementary level. So their goal is to get young people into school as quickly as possible, to regularize their lives, to get them involved in things like art therapy and class and so on. I think by and large, there's a much higher value placed on getting as many young people back into school as quickly as possible.
I have I'm kind of unsure about the way you kind of related the question of education to human rights. I'm not a human rights expert by any chance, but my sense is that usually the focus when it comes to human rights on education has to do with elementary education and not so much university education, which tends to be more related to employment. So that's one part of the question.
Can I answer right back? But where do your elementary school teachers come from to make sure that the human right of young people to education is met?
No, I understand that. But what I meant to say is that the right to education tends to be more enforced on the level of elementary education as opposed to university education, because I think it has to do with the way education is understood in these two different levels. One is about, literacy, kind of certain kind of basic education versus education for employment. But so this is just a general comment. The other part of the question was, so in Jordan, there's a lot of humanitarian work that is being done, not so much by UN institutions or other kinds of organizations that work with the concept of human rights, but kind of religious based humanitarian work. And a lot of it is educational, and it includes religious education. In a place like Jordan, obviously, Islamic education tends to be accepted, tolerated, and there's the question that kind of came to my mind when you were talking about places like Germany or the US. To what extent alternative forms of education that are not human rights based, but are kind of based on a different conception of the human, might be tolerated?
I mean, that question is so far out from my discussion. Maybe you and I can talk about that later.
Hi, Rebecca Roffey asking, you mentioned earlier that there was a significant drop-off in women attempting to attend or attending higher education, and in these areas. And I wondered if you could expand on the reasons for this, and then maybe touch on what can be done or is being done to address the problem.
So this is one of the areas where I think there should be better social scientific investigation. Because everything that we do is just based on anecdote, except that we know that these young women are saying, we're not going and our brothers are going, and that statistics from the government of Turkey in particular have indicated that the drop-off is very, very steep. All you can do is speculate, and sometimes is wrong, of course. But for example, in the Fresno case, there was social anxiety about sending women out of the household to school using public transportation if they didn't have cars. And so one of the possible solutions was to arrange a way to pick people up and so on. I tend to think that was being used as a pretext by their family more than anything else. Often decisions are being made about, within a refugee family, resources are very limited and they will need to concentrate their resources on the child that they think will be the most successful or the most able to provide. And so that becomes an elder son or a brother or something along these lines, where the women then are expected to work to help pay for that process as a kind of social exchange. But again, this is something we need to understand better, but my experience is there haven't been any concerted efforts amongst organizations that are involved in higher education to really address it. And through scholarships and so on, it just has not happened, and I find it very frustrating, because this is a problem that arose almost immediately as people moved into exile.
Hello, my name is Oliver Folber. You were speaking at the end about the distinction between civil integration versus social inclusion, and you gave the example of the Netherlands for civic integration. I was wondering if you also have an example for social inclusion or a society where that is actually working already, because I completely agree that that's a very desirable goal.
I think you see bits and pieces of social inclusion taking place, but I cannot point right now to a society that's ever really successfully done it. I mean, you've got sort of the American idea of you have a melting pot and so on, which some people would point to as, oh, we're not making people get rid of their identity, we're accommodating it. And I think that to some extent there's some truth to that, but not in a sense that I would use it as necessarily as an example. So I think in this call, it's a call to do exactly what I asked at the beginning, which is a kind of contemplative reflection on what do we, societies of want for the newcomers, and what are we prepared to do for them? And that is a conversation that societies need to have now, rather than before it becomes too acute. And we can certainly point to many situations where civic integration or social inclusion has utterly failed. I think, for example, about sort of French, the French history with their suburbs and young people. I can think about Belgium and the hardcore Islamist neighborhoods that produced sort of radicals who attacked European soil, or also sent people to fight in Syria and Iraq. So this is a call to action, to imagine what social inclusion could look like. Because my own intuition and my sense is that the payoff will be huge for democratic societies. But to do otherwise will be an enormous step back.
If you don't mind, Keith, I'd like to expand on a point you made. I've just completed a preliminary study on the issue of women refugees' access to universities in Germany. There's no data collected on that by universities or by both provincial or national governments, so it's very difficult to get complete figures. But a survey of more than 20 universities showed that the number of women attending preliminary courses was at about 5%.
Yeah, so
and in many cases, a massive drop. And in almost all cases, they were from Iran, Syria, countries where, as you've mentioned, they had fairly high levels of attendance by women. We did talk to quite a few people about the reasons, although again, not scientific, and the hope was to at least start the ball rolling to do more complete research on this. And because there's so little data collected by universities, we're going to have to do household surveys and things like that to collect that data. What we did find, though, was a lot of deeply ingrained anxiety about facing another hostile bureaucracy, that people were already engaged in an almost daily struggle to deal with a complex bureaucracy. You also have to understand that these are people who are coming from societies where bureaucracy is life-threatening. Colleagues of mine in Syria, even before the war, would talk about going to the military office to get their exemption papers once a year from military service while they were studying. And they would be often beaten. They'd have to bribe people. You very much risked being thrown in jail for a couple of days until your family came and picked you up. And that was before the war, and that was just to get the exemption from military service. So bureaucracy is a very threatening thing. They're dealing with it all day. Then they face university bureaucracies here, which are not very sympathetic, to be honest, and not very helpful. So that's one reason. You mentioned other reasons, and I won't go into those. But what we're also not seeing is the sort of outreach to refugee and migrant communities in Germany that needs to be done. You have to talk to the whole community about education and university opportunities and the upsides and downsides and what sort of investment and costs and everything else are needed. And unfortunately, we haven't got to that place yet.
The strategy that they were going to adopt in Fresno was to recruit older Arab women that were from the more established Fresno Arab community to go and sit and visit with families, right? And say that they should go and to attest to the safety and so on. So the idea was to address the problem on a community basis, not to have white guy college professor from UC Davis go tell them to go to school, right? But rather to engage members of the local community to go and do it, and then also to do some self-organizing. Because, to a person, you saw this in your research, my research is, if young women have been in university, they want to finish. And, they see this as for all the reasons that every other young woman historically had wanted to go to college, about independence and being able to make choices in life. And these are being taken away. So in many ways, there's something very, you understand the liberating potential of higher education in that moment. And then you understand the real pain, the real pain, but also the policy problem of keeping an entire generation of refugee women from going to school.
Good evening. My name is Caroline Schmidt. I work with the DAFI program of UNHCR. It was a real pleasure to listen to your presentation. One thing on the backpack, I myself have managed an application process in West Africa. Right. And that were only 80 applicants, but it was a huge paperwork, and I think the backpack can be a huge improvement. But in comparison to Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey, where you easily get 1,500 applications, that's a completely different level of paperwork, and I think that would be a vast improvement. One B, the thing was, it would be really interesting to look into data, like the gender perspective from analyzing data from the applications point of view, because there you already get information on gender, where they come from, social background, etc., and working with scholarship providers for Syrian refugees, that could be a really good starting point.
So we're doing a lot of work with DAFI, but also the tertiary group in Lebanon, who've been working very hard on sort of collecting this data and working with the scholarship application procedure. So we have a good sense, but we have a good sense of people who can qualify for scholarships. So there's 1,500 DAFI scholarships, but we think there's actually 150,000 eligible people, right? So it's doing a great job, but it's only capturing a very small number of the potential, which again I consider this a loss, right? So.
Right. So the advocacy for more scholarship providers at all the different levels and working with the government. And that would my question is like the advocacy working also with government institutions to open the higher education sector and the improvement from your project's point of view.
Well, so we've decided to do one problem at a time. Asking universities to expand opportunities is very difficult because they're already being asked by their own populations to expand opportunities, right? Then you also have, I think, the unfortunate, and this is true primarily in Western and North American universities, the use of fairly arbitrary admissions procedures for which there's no explanation except it has to do with how many people apply, what your gain is. I mean, that don't seem to correspond to being able to predict how well someone will do in a university setting, that tend to be even discriminatory against our own ethnic and religious minorities in the United States, for example. But government advocacy is one of the next important steps, but it will have a very high barrier to overcome because of the already impacted nature of public higher education in most of the states where most of the refugees are living. Right? So if you're Turkey or you're Lebanon and you increase the numbers of seats at, say, Lebanese University, why aren't you giving those to Lebanese? Right?
Before thanking Keith and then inviting you again next door, I just wanted to mention in a couple of sentences a program tomorrow night that Keith, you alluded to a bit earlier, and invite you all to participate and attend there as well. The American Academy is co-hosting a series of 2 panel discussions with the Staatsbibliothek in the main Stabi building on Potsdamer Straße, a program called Beyond Willkommenskultur, which will feature 2 panels of 4 people each, moderated by my colleague Pamela Rosenberg and me, 1 panel on the role of the arts in questions of integration, and a 2nd panel on the role of academic life and scholarship. So that's tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock in the main building of the Staatsbibliothek. You're all extremely cordially welcome to join us there. Glad to have Keith on board for the 2nd evening, but meanwhile, thank you for that wonderful talk. Thank you all for being here, and let's continue more informally next door.